Furthermore, I also want to acknowledge that this is not something that's widely held in Jewish philosophy. Most of your Jewish friends, the guy that owns a deli down the street, he might have never even heard of this. But this is something that's found in later texts, namely the Talmud and a lot of Jewish folklore that talks about this lesser key, this ring that Solomon possessed. But before we get into any of that stuff, who is this guy? Well, you probably know. He's one of the most famous biblical kings. He's literally the son of David, like the David, David and Goliath, the sculpture, Michelangelo, you know what I'm talking about. And when David dies in the 10th century BC, Solomon takes the throne and he rules Israel. And this is what's referred to as the golden age in, ancient Israeli history. The Bible portrays Solomon as exceptionally wise. He's known as the wise king. Actually, in 1 Kings chapter 3 in the Bible, the Lord appears to Solomon in a dream and he offers him anything he wants. I mean, it's pretty like on some genie vibes. He's like, what is it you want? It's yours. And he literally just sits there and he thinks about it. And, most people would have asked for wealth. That's kind of obvious, or power, or maybe a long life. Solomon asked for wisdom. Very shrewd. In order to govern his people justly. And God is so impressed by this humility in this request, that God grants Solomon not just wisdom, but also wealth and the honor that he didn't even ask for. Solomon becomes the complete package, the wisest and the richest king of his era. At least this is how the biblical writers will remember him. Then you get to the story that made his reputation. Two young women come before Solomon. Both are claiming to be the mother of the same baby. And, all the people in that time were ethnically pretty similar. So that was out. It would have been really easy if there was just like a black woman or a white woman. And they'd been like, well, we can take a guess. But everyone over there was, probably, Middle Eastern looking. So he was like, all right, how are we going to settle this? So he proposes cutting the child in half and giving each woman a share of the baby. Now, one woman agrees to this horrific solution, was like, yeah, of course, no problem. The other begs Solomon to spare the child and just give it to the other woman. She says, look, I love this child so much. Just give it to her. I'd rather he lives than to be cut in half. And Solomon identifies that woman as the true mother. Now, it's kind of a crazy story in the modern day, but it captures what the Bible wants you to see, that wisdom is the ability to see through appearances and to have clever solutions for some of the most difficult problems that are ever brought before the king. Then we have Solomon's biggest project. This is the one that ultimately defines his legacy and really cements him in Jewish and Christian literature, is that he constructs the first temple in Jerusalem. This was meant to be a permanent dwelling place for God and ultimately God's presence on earth. And it is the holiest site in Judaism. It is designed to house the Ark of the Covenant itself. So biblical writers are now describing a project on like an unimaginable scale. Tens of thousands of workers just coming in and out of these quarries and these building sites, and whole forests of cedar are cut down in Lebanon and they're floated down on rafts, and there's gold being hammered into these thin layers to be put on doors and furnishings on every surface. It's all glowing. It's the most beautiful thing you can imagine. The interior is carved with cherubim, palm trees, and flowers. A man-made like Garden of Eden on this hilltop. It's like, it must have been a sight, is what the least you could say, right? Later Jewish and Christian imagination sometimes describes the temple stones as so perfectly cut and fitted that they seemed superhuman in their craftsmanship. But in the biblical account itself, this is a massive yet entirely human undertaking. It's absolutely remarkable and miraculous, maybe. Now, according to the Bible, the text credits Solomon's organization and resources and political reach, and no supernatural assistance so far. So where does this whole demon thing come from? Well, the unofficial version starts in a very strange place. It's a text called the Testament of Solomon, and it's not a part of the biblical canon. It's what scholars call pseudepigraphal, meaning it borrows Solomon's name, but was written many centuries later, probably by a Greek-speaking Jewish or Christian world steeped in this magical, mystical tradition. And in this specific testament, the temple gets built with a cast of demons. Now, the story begins with a demon named Orneus tormenting one of Solomon's favorite workers, this young boy helping with temple construction. And every day, the demon would come at dusk when the day's wages were paid out and would take half the boy's money. And then he would take half the boy's food. And then through his thumb, he would drain something that the text itself calls the boy's life essence, and it leaves him weaker and thinner each night. Now, in the text, which again is not biblical, it's not seen as a metaphor. That's how the text describes it. The demon is literally feeding off of the child's pay and the food to sustain him and his nourishment and ultimately his life force. Now, Solomon notices that his, most favorite worker is wasting away and demands to know what's wrong with him. So then when the boy finally tells him about these visits from this demon, Solomon is devastated and angry. And he goes into the temple and he prays intensely to God for help. And the archangel Michael appears with a gift. And this is a ring engraved with a special seal. And later traditions would call this the Seal of Solomon. And using this ring, Solomon has the boy throw it at Orneus, this demon, stamping the demon with the seal and forcing him into submission. But Solomon doesn't just banish the creature. He's very clever. Again, he is the wisest king. He interrogates Orneus, demanding the names and the weaknesses of all the other spirits. And one by one, he uses this information and his divinely given ring to bind more demons and basically to put a seal on them, to stamp them, and he puts them to work. So instead of relying on human labor alone, Solomon is portrayed as commanding this invisible workforce of spirits basically to cut stones and haul materials and to construct God's house. And the theological irony here is pretty funny, right? You have these unclean spirits, these entities opposed to God that are forced to build the holiest place on earth for God to dwell. And the text seems to enjoy the contradiction, almost leans into it. Now, what's interesting is that each demon in the text has this specific function, this appearance, a characteristic way of attacking humans, and a specific angel or divine name that can defeat it. Now, Orneus, for example, is said to be thwarted when Solomon invokes an archangel, sometimes called Uriel, or Uriel in different traditions. Another demon might be bound by calling on a different angel or reciting a different prayer or formula. And the message here is that this is a catalog almost. Again, this would be known as kind of like a grimoire, which we'll talk about in a second. It's a supernatural chess game. Every dark power has a corresponding holy power. And by the end of the Testament, Solomon isn't just a wise king. He's the guy that is the king and the wisest dude and the richest with a ring and a directory of demons and a spirit crew doing the actual hard labor to build the house of God. Now, you can chalk this up to late weird folklore, which is completely reasonable. There's a lot of different grimoires or, non-canonical texts, both in Jewish, mysticism or Jewish folklore and Christian and Islamic. But another major religion also remembers Solomon as a man who commanded what humans cannot see. Now, across the desert, centuries later, another tradition would add another layer to this. So in the Quran, in Islamic tradition, Solomon, also known as Suleiman in Arabic, is granted extraordinary gifts from Allah. He understands the speech of birds. He can order the wind to basically move like a vehicle, and he's given authority over jinn. Now, if you don't know what jinn are, we actually did a whole episode talking about jinn, but it's a class of unseen beings that are made of this smokeless fire. And some of these jinn are pious. They actually serve Allah. Some are rebellious, and they have families and societies, and they even operate with free will. They're not inherently fallen angels or evil. They're almost like a parallel species that kind of lives besides human beings. Now, again, this is in mainstream Islamic literature. Now, under Suleiman, certain jinn are put to work. They dive into the sea for treasure, they forge metal, and they create these monumental structures. Now, from the human side, all you see is a king on a throne and these impossible building projects being finished ahead of schedule. Now, the Quran's most haunting scene comes at the end of Suleiman's life. One day, he's standing, leaning on his staff, overseeing the jinn as they work. At least, that's what they think. In reality, he dies on his feet, and his body just stays there, motionless, still propped up by the staff. And the jinn keep on building, terrified of his authority and the command that Suleiman has over them. And they're convinced that he's continuing to watch. Only when a tiny creature, usually described as like a termite, quietly eats through the wood does the staff eventually snap. Ultimately, the corpse collapses, and the truth is then revealed to the jinn that they had been obeying a dead man. Now, the Quranic moral here is very clear. Even jinn, with all of their powers and hidden knowledge, don't actually know everything about the world or about the unseen even. They can be fooled by appearances just like humans can. And yet, in both the Quran as well as the Testament, specifically this non-canonical text, you end up with the same basic picture that Solomon, as a man in the middle, is basically giving orders to beings that most people only hear about in stories. So now these stories exist in, some non-canonical text and some later kind of writings about Solomon, as well as Islamic literature. And it only becomes a matter of time before people start to ask, if Solomon could do this, can anyone else learn how to do this?